A racist police officer assaulted a black woman in front of her husband in a grocery store parking lot without knowing that her husband was a legendary U.S. Special Forces operative. From the outside, it looked like just another abuse of power, just another woman wrongly accused, publicly humiliated, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed like a criminal in front of strangers and the man who promised to protect her. But that officer didn't realize he had just touched the one person on earth who should never be touched. What happened next would shake an entire city, bring down a police department, and reveal a truth so dark that even the federal government had to get involved. She had just finished shopping. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the parking lot of a suburban grocery store. She was calm, carrying 2 reusable bags in one hand and a receipt in the other. Her husband was already by the car, loading the first set of groceries into the trunk. That's when it started. A cruiser pulled up fast, too fast. Tires screeched. The officer didn't ask questions. He didn't even identify himself. He jumped out, hand already on his holster, yelling commands that didn't make sense. "Let me see your hands, now. You match the description of a suspect, don't make this harder on yourself." She froze, heart pounding, confused. Her instinct was to comply, to stay calm, but the humiliation was instant. People turned. Phones came out. The officer didn't wait. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the wrist. She cried out, trying to show him the receipt, pleading for him to let her speak. But he wasn't interested in speaking. He shoved her against the hood of the car, twisting her arm behind her back. The bags hit the ground. Eggs cracked. Fruit rolled under parked cars. A tomato splattered by her feet like blood. Her husband stood motionless for half a second, processing. His training kicked in immediately, but not in the way most would think. He didn't shout. He didn't rush the officer. He didn't do anything reckless. Because he had seen this exact kind of scenario play out before, in war zones, in covert missions, in moments when the enemy underestimated the quiet ones. And right now, he wasn't a civilian. He was calculating. The officer cuffed her on the ground. She was crying, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief, because she knew the only thing she was guilty of was being black in the wrong place. That officer didn't see a wife, a mother, a woman, he saw a threat that never existed. And worse, he did it all in front of the one man who could change his life forever. She tried to speak between sobs. "I have the receipt. I paid for everything, why are you doing this to me?" "Shut your mouth." The officer barked, pressing his knee into her back. The moment those words left the officer's mouth, something shifted. Her husband's eyes narrowed. There was no rage, no panic, just a chilling focus. He walked slowly toward the scene, phone in his hand. One tap. A live stream started. He wanted the world to see, but more than that, he wanted a record. A record for what was coming next. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. Within minutes, backup arrived. The officer refused to apologize. He said she matched a description, that she had been uncooperative, that he had acted within protocol. She was released on the spot when it became clear there was no crime. No stolen items. Nothing. But the damage was done. Her dress was torn. Her arm bruised. Her dignity left behind on the asphalt. The officer smirked as he got back into his car. Thought he'd gotten away with it. Again. But that night, something began. Quietly. Methodically. Her husband disappeared, not physically, but strategically. The man who once led elite teams into foreign territories began working from the shadows. He activated contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. Digital trails were traced. Internal documents leaked. Phone calls recorded. He wasn't just fighting for his wife anymore, he was hunting down something bigger, something festering inside the system that had allowed men like that officer to rise and stay protected. Weeks passed. Nothing made the news. No one knew what was coming. But whispers began. Officers getting suspended without notice. Investigations opened. Old complaints resurfaced. And then, one name connected them all. One man who had used his badge as a weapon. One man who had buried evidence, silenced voices, falsified reports. That officer. The same one who had thrown an innocent woman to the ground while her husband watched. And the person who had exposed everything. Still silent. Still in the shadows. The morning the officer was arrested, it wasn't by local PD. It was federal. 2 black SUVs. One knock at the door. And when he was pulled from his home in handcuffs, the look on his face wasn't fear, it was confusion. He didn't understand how this had happened. Who had done this? Why now? And that's exactly how it was supposed to be. Because revenge doesn't always come with fists. Sometimes, it wears a suit, types an email, plants a bug in a phone, and lets justice fall like dominoes. But here's the thing. How did one man take down an entire corrupt system without ever being seen? And more importantly, what else is he about to expose? Stay with us. The story is just beginning. Before we begin this story, we want to send a message of support to every black viewer watching right now. We see you, we stand with you, and we will never tolerate racism in any form, not in real life, not in fiction. This channel, Plow of Twist, is committed to telling stories that expose injustice and uplift those who rise above it. Now, sit back and get ready. Because the story you're about to hear is going to hit hard, twist fast, and stay with you long after it ends. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Enjoy the ride. The city of Charlotte, North Carolina, wasn't the kind of place where people expected headlines to be made overnight. It was a growing city, sure, tech startups, good schools, quiet neighborhoods where parents walked their kids to elementary school, where everyone nodded politely in the grocery store, and most people tried to stay in their own lanes. But beneath the charm, the brunch spots, and the real estate flyers, there were fractures, small ones, hairline cracks in how people lived together, how they looked at one another, how they judged what belonged and what didn't. That tension didn't scream, it whispered. And for people like Isaiah Warren, it was a sound he'd learned to hear even when others refused to acknowledge it. Isaiah was in his late 30s, a tall, quietly imposing black man with a presence that made people step back without knowing why. He didn't need to talk much to own a room. The way he moved, measured, alert, composed, left people guessing if he was military, law enforcement, or something they couldn't quite place. His body bore the wear of years most would never understand. Years of sandstorms, night operations, silence, and secrets. But now, he worked in IT security for a financial firm downtown. That's what he told people, at least. His resume was real enough to check out, but the details never added up, not fully. And no one really asked twice. He was the kind of man people instinctively respected, even if they didn't know why. The kind of man who could stare through you without ever raising his voice. The kind of man whose calm was always just a curtain. Isaiah had spent the last few years trying to live quietly. He had done his part. More than his part. He had worn the uniform, obeyed the impossible, carried out what others couldn't even hear about, and now all he wanted was peace. His wife, Danielle, was everything that word meant to him. A high school counselor, brilliant, kind, a soft-spoken woman with steel behind her eyes. She was the one who had taught him how to sleep with both eyes closed again. The one who reminded him he didn't have to scan every room before sitting down. They had a daughter together, Amari, 9 years old, all curiosity and energy, and a mind too sharp for her age. Their life was modest, not flashy. A 3-bedroom house with a well-kept garden Danielle loved to work on. Isaiah spent weekends fixing things just for the sake of keeping his hands busy. For the first time in his life, things felt like they could be normal. Or at least close. But even in the calmest waters, there are things that lie beneath. Danielle had always been more patient than Isaiah. She gave people the benefit of the doubt. Believed in systems, in conversations, in change through listening. That was her way. Even when she came home from work with stories about parents who looked down on her, or colleagues who subtly questioned her decisions, she would just smile and say, "They'll come around." Isaiah would listen, nod, and bury his thoughts in silence. Because if he ever spoke what he really felt, if he ever gave in to the weight he carried from the things he'd seen, he knew it would come out sharper than anyone was ready for. The neighborhood they lived in was gentrifying. Slowly, then all at once. Coffee shops replaced corner stores. Rent went up. Patrol cars started appearing more frequently, not because crime had risen, but because the faces in the community had changed. Danielle felt it first. That shift in tone, the long glances when she parked her car, the way people asked her if she lived around here even after a year of living there. Isaiah noticed too. But again, he stayed quiet. The truth was, he had a different lens for danger. One that didn't blink as quickly. One that calculated risk, remembered details, planned exits. The day it happened started like any other. A Saturday morning, warm air creeping in through the curtains. Danielle was out early, she liked to beat the crowds, and Isaiah was home with Amari, building a Lego city on the living room floor. Danielle had gone to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. Nothing urgent. Nothing special. Just a simple meal for their little family to enjoy together. The plan was to meet her there once she finished checking out, help load the bags, maybe grab a treat for Amari on the way back. Simple. Normal. Beautifully boring. The store was a local chain, one of the nicer ones. Clean, wide aisles, organic everything. It was the kind of place where shoppers didn't worry about prices as much as presentation. Danielle moved through the store with ease. She knew where everything was. She smiled at the older woman behind the bakery counter, waved to the teenage cashier she always saw on weekends. She paid for her groceries, took her receipt, and began walking to the car where Isaiah was already pulling up to the curb. But she never made it to the car. A police cruiser pulled in fast from the opposite side of the lot, nearly hitting a shopping cart. Tires screeched. Doors flung open. Shouts echoed across the pavement. The officer didn't ask for ID. Didn't ask what she was doing. He ordered her to stop. She paused, confused, then kept walking, holding her bags in one hand and her receipt in the other. The officer barked louder, demanded she put the bags down and get on her knees. She turned, calmly trying to speak, to explain she had just paid, to show the receipt. That's when he grabbed her. From the car, Isaiah saw it. He had just stepped out, one hand still on the driver's side door. What he saw didn't make sense at first. It didn't compute. It was a surreal collision of what should never happen to the woman he loved. Danielle, forced to the ground. Her cheek hitting the asphalt. Her wrists yanked behind her. Groceries spilling everywhere. People stopped, watched. Some filmed. No one intervened. Not yet. Isaiah didn't rush forward. Not because he didn't want to, but because every fiber of his training told him that right now, one wrong move could escalate everything beyond repair. The officer had no idea who he had just touched. Danielle was speaking, voice shaking but steady, saying she paid for everything, saying she wasn't resisting, saying this was a mistake. The officer kept shouting over her. Telling her to shut up. Calling her uncooperative. Treating her like a threat. It wasn't about the receipt. It wasn't about the groceries. It wasn't even about mistaken identity. It was about power. About a badge, a bias, and a decision made in a single glance. Danielle wasn't a person to that man. She was a problem he thought needed controlling. Isaiah stood still, his daughter watching from the back seat, her wide eyes barely blinking. He made one phone call. Short. Precise. Then he began walking. Not toward the officer. Not toward Danielle. But toward a quiet corner of the lot where the store's security camera had full view of the scene. He wanted angles. He wanted footage. Because this wasn't something to be solved with shouting. This would be solved with evidence, with silence, with strategy. Backup arrived. Other officers. No one apologized. Danielle was finally released when it became clear she had done nothing wrong. No charges. No explanation. Just a shrug, a claim that she fit a vague description, and a ride home in silence. Isaiah didn't speak on the drive back. Danielle didn't either. Amari fell asleep in the back seat, her small head leaning against the window. Something had shifted in that car. Something permanent. That night, Isaiah went into the garage and stayed there for hours. His laptop open. His phone constantly buzzing. Conversations in encrypted channels. Files downloaded. A familiar rhythm returning to his hands. Not anger. Not vengeance. Precision. Strategy. Focus. He wasn't just going after a man. He was preparing to dismantle a system. And no one, was ready for what was coming. Danielle hadn't returned to the grocery store since the incident. Even though the store issued a weak public apology, even though the manager said they had nothing to do with law enforcement procedures, the trauma clung to her like a shadow. She flinched when a patrol car drove past their street, avoided eye contact with strangers in public, and had begun waking in the middle of the night without reason. Her bruises faded quickly, but something else didn't. Something internal. A fracture, quiet and invisible. She didn't talk about it much. But the silence spoke louder than any confession could. Isaiah watched her every day with a growing sense of quiet rage, the kind of rage that doesn't erupt, it calculates. At first, Danielle didn't know what Isaiah was doing. He had become more withdrawn, taking late-night calls outside, setting up equipment in the garage that she didn't recognize, locking folders with encrypted passwords she had never seen him use before. When she asked, he just said, "I'm working on something." She didn't press. She trusted him. But part of her was afraid. Not of him, but of what he was capable of when pushed. Danielle had never seen that side of her husband before, not truly. She had heard whispers from old friends, had pieced together fragments of his past from the gaps in his stories. But now, for the first time, she saw him step back into that darkness. And she didn't know whether to be comforted or terrified. One night, as they sat on the back porch, Isaiah finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, almost too calm. He said he had started looking into the officer who had assaulted her. His name was Officer Dale Riker, and he wasn't new to controversy. Isaiah had found 3 previous complaints for excessive force, 2 from black men, 1 from a Latina woman. None had led to charges. Internal Affairs had buried the files. But Isaiah had them now. He was tracing connections, finding patterns, mapping relationships between Riker and a cluster of other officers. "It's not just about what happened to you," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's about what they've gotten away with. What they think they'll always get away with." Danielle hesitated. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. Isaiah didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed her a tablet. On it was a video, surveillance footage from the grocery store parking lot, the moment she was thrown to the ground. She hadn't seen it from that angle before. It was worse than she remembered. The sound of her own voice pleading, the look on the officer's face, the passive faces of the onlookers, it all poured back in. Her hands trembled. Isaiah placed his over hers. "This isn't just evidence," he said. "It's leverage." Isaiah knew he couldn't take on the system with emotion alone. He needed precision. And above all, he needed a plan that didn't lead back to him. So, he He started small. He created a new identity, an anonymous whistleblower who began feeding encrypted documents to investigative journalists. Documents that revealed not only Riker's disciplinary history but also falsified arrest reports, internal cover-ups, and text messages between officers mocking black residents of the neighborhood. Within 2 weeks, local media picked up the story. Anonymous source reveals disturbing pattern in CPD. It was only the beginning. At work, Isaiah kept his facade. He smiled at co-workers, met deadlines, even joined a lunch meeting with the cybersecurity team as if nothing had changed. But his nights were consumed with strategy. He reached out to an old contact, Agent Lorna Kim, a former intelligence analyst who now worked with the Department of Justice on police corruption cases. They hadn't spoken in nearly 8 years. But when she answered, her tone shifted the moment she heard his voice. "Isaiah? Is this about what I think it is?" He nodded slowly. "I need access. And I need it to look like it didn't come from me." She hesitated. "You sure about this?" "I wasn't," he replied. But then he put his hands on my wife. They arranged a drop. Nothing in writing. No digital trail. Just a USB drive, passed hand to hand in a downtown alley like something from a spy novel. On it were weeks' worth of data, recorded calls, bodycam footage mysteriously absent from official archives, and names of officers, judges, attorneys who had looked the other way. It was a risk. A huge one. But Isaiah wasn't playing to expose one man anymore. He was playing to collapse a structure. Danielle, meanwhile, was changing too. She had begun documenting her own experience, writing everything down, not just for herself, but as testimony. Her counselor instincts told her she couldn't bury this. One night, she read aloud to Isaiah something she had written. "When someone steals your dignity in public, they don't just humiliate you. They unmake you, piece by piece, in front of everyone. But survival is the quiet decision to put yourself back together, even when no one's watching." Isaiah didn't speak. But his eyes glistened. Meanwhile, Officer Riker was growing uneasy. The story had gone viral. Protesters began appearing at City Hall with signs bearing his name. His patrol car was tagged one night with the word "abuser" in red spray paint. He filed a report about harassment, claiming he was being targeted unfairly. Privately, he bragged to colleagues that nothing would come of it. "They always make noise," he laughed. "Then they move on." But behind closed doors, his voice cracked more than once. Tension gripped the city. A city council meeting turned heated when a local activist demanded Riker's suspension. Community leaders organized panels, demanded reform, while police officials stumbled through vague promises and deflections. Danielle was invited to speak but declined. She said she'd speak when it mattered. When it would make a difference. And Isaiah was still watching. Listening. Gathering. Every move Riker made was being tracked. Every conversation, every deleted message. Isaiah had tapped into an internal police communication network, illegally, of course, but flawlessly. He discovered something critical. Riker wasn't just a bad apple. He was connected to a group of officers who called themselves the Hold Line, an unofficial brotherhood with racist codes, secret meetups, and protection from higher-ups. That's when Isaiah realized the scope was far greater than he thought. He wasn't just fighting corruption. He was fighting a cult. Isaiah needed to get closer. He staged a casual run-in with Riker at a local coffee shop. Just a glance. Just enough to plant a seed. Riker noticed him. Didn't recognize him. But something about Isaiah's calm, controlled gaze unsettled him. Later that night, Riker searched his image in an internal database. Found nothing. Just a name from a minor traffic ticket 5 years ago. Still, something gnawed at him. He didn't know it yet, but the hunter had just looked him in the eye. The final piece came from Amari. She had drawn a picture at school, her family standing together, her mom smiling, and a shadow behind them. Her teacher asked what it meant. She replied, "That's the man who tried to hurt my mommy. But Daddy's going to make sure he can never do that again." Danielle brought the drawing home in tears. Isaiah took it, folded it gently, and placed it in the drawer beside his laptop. The mission had become personal long ago. But now it had become sacred. He stared at the monitor one last time that night. Dozens of files open, evidence ready, connections mapped. A final email drafted but unsent. One push would bring it all crashing down. One click. But it had to be the right time. The perfect time. Because what was about to happen next wouldn't just change their lives. It would shake the entire city to its core. And the man who thought he was untouchable was about to find out exactly who had touched his world. But how, exactly, would one man pull the strings so precisely? What final card was Isaiah about to play? You're not ready for what's coming next. The city moved through the motions, blind to the storm quietly gathering above its skyline. There were whispers now, rumors spreading faster than officials could contain. Internal affairs had gone silent. Journalists received anonymous files they couldn't verify fast enough. In precinct hallways, officers began looking over their shoulders. Some resigned quietly. Others spoke in hushed tones about the hold line, wondering who had leaked the name. But Officer Dale Riker didn't waver. He paced with arrogance, believing that if he just kept his head down and made noise about being the real victim, the system would shield him like it always had. He still wore his badge, carried his gun, walked into that building every morning like a man untouchable. Until the morning he was summoned to a meeting. The email came from the chief's office. Standard language. Nothing alarming. But when Riker entered the building and turned the corner toward the conference room, he froze. Inside were three unfamiliar suits. Not city council. Not state. Federal. The woman in the center had a presence that swallowed the room. Her name was Agent Lorna Kim. And when she asked him to sit, her tone made it clear there was no choice. Riker looked around, smirking faintly. "Can someone tell me what this is about?" Agent Kim slid a folder across the table. "Open it." He flipped it open and immediately stiffened. Inside were screenshots of text messages he had thought deleted. Comments about suspects. Crude, racist slurs. Digital threads leading directly to locker room conversations and encrypted group chats from the hold line. He swallowed hard but tried to maintain his posture. "This is all out of context," he muttered, voice lower now. Lorna didn't blink. "Is it? Because there's video too." She tapped her tablet and turned it to him. It was bodycam footage, one he assumed had been erased. His face. His voice. Clear as day. The way he handled Danielle. The words he used. The way he looked around after it was done, casual, indifferent. His mask cracked. "What is this?" he asked again, louder this time, frustration rising. "This," she said calmly, "is evidence. And it's just the beginning." That same morning, across town, Danielle sat in her car outside the courthouse. Her palms were cold despite the warmth of the day. Isaiah sat beside her, silent. She had agreed to testify. She wasn't being forced. This was her choice. Not out of revenge, but clarity. There was a difference. And Isaiah had told her that whatever came next, she would never be alone in the room. As they walked through the side entrance, escorted by two federal officers, Isaiah caught a glimpse of the press waiting out front. Cameras. Microphones. Signs. This wasn't a private war anymore. It had become something bigger. Something public. He had moved the first pieces. But now, it was Danielle who would shift the entire board. Inside, the hearing began. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it held weight. Local reporters, a few key witnesses, a federal observer from the DOJ. Riker was seated at the front, now dressed in plain clothes, no badge, no weapon. He glanced back once. Then again, when Danielle entered the room. His eyes widened slightly. He recognized her, of course, but something had changed. The way she walked. The way she stood. She wasn't the woman on the ground anymore. She was the storm. She was sworn in. The prosecutor began carefully, respectfully. Danielle spoke clearly, with grace, but each word landed like stone. He never asked me a question. Never looked at my receipt. He decided who I was the second he saw me. There was no theatrics. No sobs. Just quiet truth. And when I tried to speak, he made me feel like my voice didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. That kind of humiliation, it stays with you. It sits in your bones. Riker's attorney objected once. Overruled. The judge, a woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, made it clear early on, there would be no interruptions unless legally necessary. Danielle continued, and Isaiah watched from the benches, fists clenched under folded arms. He had done everything he could to prepare this moment. But this was her fight now. And she was standing taller than he had ever seen her. Later, during a recess, Riker was escorted through a hallway. That's when it happened. The moment he finally saw Isaiah up close, standing by a window, calm as ever. Their eyes locked. The recognition came slow. But it came. "You," Riker said, stopping in his tracks, voice barely controlled. Isaiah didn't move. Didn't smirk. Just replied, "You really should have known who she was standing next to." Riker stepped forward, but his escort blocked him. "You set me up," he spat, voice lower, teeth clenched. Isaiah's voice stayed even. "I didn't have to. You set yourself up the moment you thought you could get away with it." Riker's lips twitched. "You're not even a cop." Isaiah stepped closer, still within the invisible boundary the agents had allowed. "No. I'm worse. I'm someone who finishes what others are afraid to start." Riker was yanked away before he could respond, but that exchange stayed with him. The next day, more files were released. Names. Dates. Timestamps. Internal complaints that were never addressed. Videos. Leaked audio. All sourced from one mysterious file drop titled Operation Line Cut. Local officials scrambled. The mayor issued a statement. The police chief resigned. And one by one, members of the hold line were placed under federal review. Some turned on each other. Others disappeared into silence. But the biggest shock hadn't come yet. Back in their home, Isaiah sat with Danielle and Amari around the dinner table. The atmosphere was calm, almost strange. Amari asked about school. Danielle laughed at something Isaiah said. But the moment came when Danielle turned to him and asked, "Why now? Why did you wait so long to act?" Isaiah exhaled slowly. "Because I was waiting for the right target." Riker wasn't the first. But he was the loudest. The sloppiest. The one who left enough behind to open every door I needed. Danielle looked down, thoughtful. "So what happens now?" Isaiah's answer was quiet. "Now, they start to realize their time is up." But there was one final detail Isaiah hadn't shared. Something even Danielle didn't know. A piece he had kept until the right moment. Because one more domino was about to fall. And when it did, the world would know exactly who had been pulling the strings from the shadows all along. Are you ready to find out what Isaiah's final move is? Because nothing you've heard so far compares to what's coming next. The silence that settled over the city in the days following the hearing wasn't peace, it was tension holding its breath. The media had its headlines. The community had its outrage. But Isaiah had something no one else did: closure waiting to be delivered. The weight of everything he had built, the careful strategy, the silent sabotage, the data collected in layers over weeks, still sat untouched in one final folder. Labeled not with names, but with a single phrase: hearts of stone. It was more than evidence. It was the collapse of an entire structure dressed in uniforms. He hadn't just exposed Riker. He had used Riker as the catalyst, the crack in the foundation. Now he stood holding the wrecking ball, waiting for the precise moment to swing. That moment came when Agent Kim called unexpectedly. Her voice was sharper this time, more urgent, the tone of someone who had seen what she wasn't supposed to. "Isaiah, I don't know how you got access to these files, and I'm not going to ask. But you need to know what's in the final drop. It's not just patrol officers anymore. You've touched command. You've touched judiciary. You even touched campaign donors. If this goes public, it won't just burn the department, it'll ignite the whole system." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke with chilling precision. "Good. Let them burn." That night, Danielle walked into the garage where Isaiah had spent so many of his hours lately. She stood by the door for a moment, watching him. The screens around him glowed softly, his face lit in fragments of blue and white. There was something different in him now, not just focus, but a stillness that came after long storms. He wasn't hiding anything anymore. He was waiting. She approached slowly, setting her hand gently on his shoulder. "Is it done?" Isaiah nodded, but didn't look at her. "Almost. The last move has to be public. Not from behind a screen. They need to see it. Hear it. And know exactly who's been watching them." Danielle sat beside him. Her voice was soft, but firm. "I want to be there." Isaiah finally turned to her. "It's not going to be clean. It's going to upset people. Powerful people. You sure you want to stand in the middle of it?" She looked at him without hesitation. "He didn't just hurt me, Isaiah. He humiliated me. In front of you. In front of strangers. He made me feel like I didn't exist. If standing with you helps make sure no other woman goes through that, then yes, I want to be there." The next morning, Danielle and Isaiah stood side by side at a press conference organized not by the police, but by community leaders. The small park where they had gathered overflowed with people, some curious, some angry, others simply tired of being ignored. A makeshift podium was set up. Local press swarmed the area. And when Danielle stepped up to speak, the murmurs ceased. She didn't speak with rage. She didn't shout. Her voice was calm, unwavering. She told her story, not just the moment of the assault, but the years of microaggressions, of being underestimated, of being watched in stores, of being spoken over in meetings. She didn't say Riker's name once. Instead, she described the pain of being invisible and the power of finally being seen. Her words wrapped around the crowd like a quiet storm. Then Isaiah stepped up. He didn't have a speech prepared. No notes. Just his voice. "For years, I operated in silence. I was trained to observe. To collect. To act only when necessary. And for a long time, I believed the battlefield was somewhere else, foreign soil, distant enemies. But then I saw my wife on the ground, and I realized the war was always here. Just hidden behind badges and policies. So I did what I was trained to do. I documented. I connected. And when the time was right, I exposed. What I'm about to show you will not be easy to watch. But it is necessary." He tapped the device in his pocket. A large screen lit up behind him. And one by one, files began to appear. Footage of internal meetings. Racist language exchanged between officers. Judge rulings that contradicted direct evidence. Emails referencing cleanup jobs. The crowd gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others wept. What had been whispers were now undeniable truths, displayed publicly in high definition. Journalists scrambled to record. Phones shot into the air. Officials who had been watching remotely began drafting statements. Some tried to discredit the files. Others quietly resigned. But no one could unsee what had been seen. At the end of the presentation, Isaiah paused. The screen faded to black. He looked out at the crowd, eyes sweeping slowly across the faces. Justice isn't a courtroom. It's not a badge. It's a decision. And sometimes, that decision takes people willing to risk everything to make it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Isaiah sat alone on the steps of their porch. Danielle came out, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one, then sat beside him in silence. The air between them was heavy, not with tension, but release. She broke the silence first. You did what they said was impossible. Isaiah shook his head lightly. We did. You stood up. You spoke. You carried the weight with me. Danielle leaned her head on his shoulder. So what now? Isaiah looked out at the quiet street. Now we see who's brave enough to stand in the light. But the final twist hadn't landed yet. That night, as Isaiah prepared to shut down his system, a message appeared on his screen. Not from Agent Kim. Not from a journalist. It was a direct alert from a federal server. The subject line read, "Confidential, urgent response required." Isaiah opened it, eyes narrowing as he read. The message was clear. A deeper ring had been exposed. One that included political figures, law enforcement, even federal contractors. And the person who had pulled most of the strings in the cover-up, was someone Isaiah once called a brother-in-arms. A name he hadn't heard in years. Isaiah stared at the screen, unmoving. Danielle stepped into the doorway. Everything all right? He turned slowly. We're not done. Not even close. Because the fight that had started with one assault, had just unearthed a war. The ripple effects of the exposé shattered the illusion of stability across the city. Overnight, the police department's name became synonymous with disgrace. Arrests were made. Resignations streamed in. Lawsuits multiplied. Social media swarmed with voices, some filled with vindication, others enraged by the disruption of the status quo. The public was divided. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning. For others, it was chaos disguised as justice. But what none of them knew was that the deeper fire hadn't even reached the surface yet. The files Isaiah leaked had cracked the outer shell. What remained hidden inside that final classified message was more than corruption, it was betrayal. Personal. Surgical. Deep enough to tear through years of trust. Isaiah hadn't spoken to Marcus Caldwell in over a decade. They had served together in Afghanistan, shared missions no one dared to debrief in full, and bonded over choices they were never supposed to live with. Marcus had been his brother in every way but blood. But the name that appeared in the encrypted DOJ alert confirmed the unthinkable. Marcus was not only involved in shielding the hold line, he had actively been one of its silent protectors, leveraging his status within a federal security firm to keep evidence buried and whistleblowers silenced. Worse, he had inserted himself into the city's infrastructure over the past few years, offering consultation to local law enforcement under the guise of community protection optimization. Isaiah had unknowingly been pulling at a thread that ran right back to the man he once trusted with his life. He sat in the dark of his home office for nearly an hour, the glow of the monitor painting hard lines across his face. Danielle had gone to bed. The house was still. But his mind was not. He replayed conversations from years ago. Words Marcus had once said about order and control, warnings Isaiah had brushed off at the time as the natural cynicism of a man too long in the field. But now those words curdled in his memory, revealing new meanings. Isaiah thought he had been waging war against a broken institution, not realizing he had walked straight into a battlefield littered with ghosts from his own past. When Isaiah finally confronted Agent Kim the next morning, she wasn't surprised. Her eyes said everything. She had known, or at least suspected. But protocol kept her hands tied until now. We were tracking Marcus for months, she admitted, glancing down at the report. He kept things compartmentalized. Never left a trail. You, Isaiah, you exposed him without even knowing it. That file dump you gave us was the first real crack. Isaiah leaned forward, his voice flat. So now what? He gets arrested. Disappears behind some federal curtain. Kim didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the folder and looked him in the eye. He's not going down quietly. Men like him never do. Isaiah's pulse thudded. What are you saying? I'm saying, we may need your help again. This time, officially. It was a cruel irony. Isaiah had spent the past decade burying that part of himself, denying the soldier, silencing the operative, and now the very skills he tried to leave behind were being summoned again. Except this time, it wasn't a foreign threat. It was someone who had stood beside him, fought with him, laughed in desert camps and patched up his wounds. And now, that same man had orchestrated harm against Isaiah's wife, his city, and perhaps hundreds of others under the illusion of safeguarding order. Danielle didn't take the news well. She listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Isaiah finished explaining, she stood slowly from the table, walked to the sink, and stared out the window for what felt like forever. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. Are you going after him? Isaiah didn't answer right away. He walked to her, touched her shoulder. If I do, it's not for revenge. It's to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. Danielle turned to him, eyes heavy. You say that. But this man, he's not just anyone. He's your past. You don't come out of something like this unchanged, Isaiah. You can't pretend this is just another operation. Isaiah nodded. I'm not pretending. But the truth was, he didn't know who he would be on the other side of this. The man who had spent years clawing his way back to peace was now staring into the very abyss he had once sworn never to return to. And the moral weight of it all hung over him like a verdict not yet passed. The days that followed blurred between strategy and soul-searching. Isaiah didn't want vengeance. He wanted accountability. But as the scope of Marcus's influence became clearer, phony non-profit programs, quietly funded political candidates, undercover surveillance of protest organizers, it also became clear that Marcus hadn't just crossed lines. He had drawn new ones in blood. A secure meet was arranged in a remote location. No press. No agents. Just two men. No weapons, but both carried something far heavier. Marcus arrived dressed casually, his posture still confident, still playing the role of the composed tactician. Isaiah stood across from him, arms folded, jaw set. I should have known, Isaiah said quietly, his voice barely audible against the wind. Marcus offered a faint smile, not smug, almost remorseful. You always were too righteous for your own good. You were supposed to protect people, Marcus. Not manipulate them. I did protect them, Marcus replied, eyes narrowing. From chaos. From themselves. You think order comes from truth? No, Isaiah. It comes from control. From guiding people quietly. Subtly. You wanted to expose them? Fine. But when the system collapses, don't come crying to me when you see what rises in its place. Isaiah shook his head slowly. You're not a guardian. You're a coward hiding behind power. Marcus's smile faded. And you? Still playing the noble soldier. Still convincing yourself your hands are clean. That cut deeper than Isaiah expected. But he didn't flinch. I didn't build a machine that destroys people and call it order. You dismantled it with no plan for what comes next. Isaiah took a slow breath. I didn't come here to debate morality. I came to tell you it's over. The files are out. Your network is unraveling. You can either cooperate, or be taken. Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Marcus whispered, almost to himself, I thought we were the same. Isaiah's answer was firm. That's the last lie you'll ever believe. They left without violence. Without theatrics. But the silence between them was louder than gunfire. Within 48 hours, Marcus Caldwell was in federal custody. His arrest didn't make national headlines. Too dangerous. Too complicated. But for those who mattered, for those who had been silenced for years, it was everything. Danielle watched the news update with tears in her eyes. Not because justice had been served completely. But because for the first time, something had shifted. The silence had cracked. Isaiah stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her back. He didn't say much. There were no celebrations, no victory speeches. Just stillness. The world was watching now. And it still had one final truth left to hear. The news of Marcus Caldwell's arrest didn't roar through the city, it rippled. Quietly. Like a tide changing beneath the surface, shifting things people didn't even realize were unstable. It wasn't splashed across television screens or printed in bold headlines. It moved through the right channels. The whispers behind closed doors. The heavy silences in courtrooms. The nervous glances in office buildings. And for the first time in a long time, those who had felt invincible began to hesitate. But for Isaiah, there was no sense of triumph. No closure yet. Only the weight of what it had cost. The nights of watching Danielle try to piece herself back together. The conversations he never got to have with Marcus before everything rotted between them. The echo of his own voice in that last meeting, cutting through a silence he used to share with someone who had once called him brother. Isaiah found himself walking through the city differently now. People recognized him, some with nods of gratitude, others with wary looks, unsure of what exactly he had done but sensing it had changed something fundamental. He didn't seek validation, but the stares still stuck to his skin. Danielle noticed it too. One afternoon, while walking out of a bookstore with Amari, someone stopped her. A woman, mid-40s, clearly emotional. She thanked Danielle. Said her teenage son had once been harassed by a cop who later turned out to be connected to the Hold line. The woman hugged her, briefly, tightly, then walked away before Danielle could even respond. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Danielle told Isaiah about it, her voice fragile and tired. She said she didn't know what to feel. Gratitude? Grief? Some strange combination of both. Isaiah held her hand and told her that whatever she felt was valid. That surviving something like this didn't come with a manual, and that being seen was never as simple as people imagined it to be. Later that same week, Isaiah was called to testify in a private hearing organized by a federal oversight board. He didn't want to go at first. He didn't trust the politics behind the curtain. But Agent Kim assured him this wasn't about silencing the truth, it was about making sure what he exposed didn't vanish under bureaucracy. The hearing was held in a sterile room with no cameras, no microphones, just men and women in suits and the faint hum of a ceiling vent. Isaiah sat at the center, a table between him and the panel. They asked questions. They praised his courage. But at some point, the tone shifted. One board member, an older man with a polished voice, leaned forward and asked Isaiah if he had considered the precedent he'd set. That exposing corruption without going through proper channels could encourage other civilians to take justice into their own hands. Isaiah stared at him for a long moment, then spoke slowly. I followed every channel. Every procedure. Every appeal. Do you know what those got us? Bruises on my wife's arms and silence in every office that was supposed to help her. You want to talk about precedent? Let's start with what it means when people are told they don't matter enough to protect. The room went quiet. No one interrupted. Another board member cleared her throat and asked about his methods, his surveillance, his data collection, the legality of his tactics. Again, Isaiah didn't back down. I didn't break laws. I exposed the people who did. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourselves why you let them stay hidden for so long. When he walked out of the room, Agent Kim was waiting. She didn't speak, just nodded with a kind of respect that didn't need words. She knew what it cost him to say those things out loud, to stare down power and not flinch. They weren't allies in the traditional sense, but they understood each other now. And that was enough. Back home, the atmosphere had shifted. Amari was back to laughing freely, drawing again, asking questions about the world with that boundless curiosity only children carried. Danielle was teaching again, though cautiously. She still avoided certain routes. Still paused when she saw a patrol car too close. Healing wasn't linear. Isaiah knew that. But he watched her reclaim small pieces of herself each day. And that was something he held on to. A few nights later, as they sat on the porch under a sky thick with stars, Danielle turned to him and asked something she hadn't before. Do you think we made it worse? Isaiah looked at her, confused. She continued, her eyes shining in the moonlight. Not just for us. For others. What if people retaliate? What if they use what you did to justify more hate? Isaiah didn't answer right away. He stared out into the dark for a long moment, then took a breath. I don't think truth ever makes things worse. It just makes them clearer. People don't get to look away anymore. And that scares them. But I'd rather face a world where people are forced to see each other than live in one where we all pretend everything's fine. She nodded slowly. There was no perfect answer. Only truth, and the courage to sit with it. A few days later, Isaiah received an unmarked envelope at his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a flash drive and a single note, you only scratched the surface. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but something in Isaiah's gut told him it was from someone on the inside. Someone who had seen the fallout and decided to come forward. He plugged it into an offline computer and began sorting through the files. They were deeper than he expected. Conversations between city planners, secret donations to police unions, manipulation of surveillance programs to target specific communities. This wasn't just local. It was systemic. Rooted. Multi-layered. He realized then that what he and Danielle had been through was one thread in a much larger web. And that even though they had torn down one part, the architecture of oppression was still standing elsewhere. It hit him like a second wave, this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed up reading through the files, organizing them, building connections. And by morning, he had made a decision. When Danielle woke, she found him in the garage again, the lights on, the boards filled with notes, patterns, strings connecting names to institutions. She stood in the doorway and said softly, "You're going back in." Isaiah looked at her, his face unreadable. "I can't walk away. Not now." She stepped forward. "You can. You've done more than most would ever dream. You gave me my voice back. You gave this city a chance to breathe. That has to be enough." Isaiah shook his head. "Not when I know there's more. Not when someone else is going to get hurt because I stopped too soon." Danielle's voice cracked. "Then promise me something. Promise me you won't lose yourself. Promise me you'll come back." Isaiah walked to her, wrapped his arms around her. "I promise. But this time, I need your help." And for the first time since this all began, she didn't just support him, she joined him. Side by side, they sat down at that table. She combed through documents while he traced digital trails. They weren't just victims anymore. They were architects of change. And the world around them was about to feel the full weight of that partnership. Because Isaiah Warren had never been a hero. He had never wanted that label. But what he had become, through pain, through truth, through love, was something more dangerous than any uniform or title. He had become a witness. And witnesses don't look away. Not anymore. In the weeks that followed, Isaiah and Danielle became something neither of them had ever intended to be, leaders in the shadows. Not by ambition, not by some grand plan, but by necessity. They weren't building a movement in the traditional sense. There were no banners, no podiums, no campaign slogans. What they were doing was far more dangerous. They were building knowledge. Gathering names. Tracing patterns. Connecting pain to policy. Every night, after putting Amari to bed, they sat down at that garage table, their fingers flying across keyboards, voices low and deliberate, their minds locked in a rhythm that only came from two people who had been through fire and survived it together. Danielle handled the data with a precision that rivaled Isaiah's tactical mind. She had a way of looking at numbers like they were people, understanding what trends meant in real lives. Isaiah, meanwhile, still had contacts, those who didn't wear badges anymore but hadn't lost their ears in the right places. One of those nights, Danielle turned to him, her eyes burning with something that wasn't anger, but wasn't peace either. She showed him a document, an internal memo detailing a planned expansion of surveillance in specific neighborhoods, labeled under Urban Security Reformation. It was written in polite, bureaucratic language, but the meaning was clear: more cameras, more patrols, more silence disguised as safety. "Do you see this?" she asked, voice steady but trembling just beneath the surface. "They're already trying to rebuild it. Right under our noses." Isaiah leaned in, scanning the words, his jaw tightening. They never stop. They just shift tactics. Change the uniform. Change the name. But it's the same machine. Danielle closed the file, sat back, and looked at him. "Then we can't stop either." Isaiah didn't answer at first. He was staring at her, not just seeing her, but realizing how far she had come from the woman who once tried to reason with her aggressor in a grocery store parking lot. There was no more pleading in her voice. Only resolve. And in that moment, something settled between them. Not bitterness. Not vengeance. Just clarity. Their work became more organized. Danielle started using her connections through education to speak with counselors, teachers, and administrators, collecting testimony from students who had experienced over-policing in their schools. Isaiah compiled digital records and cross-referenced them with department databases, exposing how disciplinary actions disproportionately targeted black students under the guise of safety protocols. It wasn't just about Riker anymore. It was about what allowed Riker to exist. To thrive. To be protected. And the more they uncovered, the more Isaiah understood why so many people gave up. Because fighting this meant never stopping. Never sleeping. Never letting your guard down. And yet, even in the exhaustion, there was power. Purpose. For the first time in years, Isaiah didn't feel like he was waiting for the next fight. He was in it, and this time, on his own terms. Then came the invitation. A well-known podcast focused on criminal justice and race reached out. They wanted Danielle and Isaiah to tell their story. Danielle was hesitant. She wasn't sure what good it would do. But Isaiah surprised her when he said yes. Not for fame. Not for drama. But because people needed to hear it without filters. Without edits. Danielle sat across from the host, microphone in front of her, headphones wrapped around her ears, and for the first few minutes, she barely spoke. But when she did, the entire room stilled. She talked about the fear of that day. Not the physical pain, but the emotional betrayal. The realization that her dignity could be taken so easily in front of people who would rather film than intervene. She spoke about how it changed her, about how silence became unbearable after that. She said, I used to believe that if I just played by the rules, stayed kind, stayed professional, the world would treat me fairly. But what happened in that parking lot showed me that respectability isn't armor. It's camouflage. And one day, someone decides they're tired of seeing it. Isaiah followed, his voice deeper, measured. He didn't recount the technicalities of the operation or the surveillance tactics he'd used. Instead, he talked about love. About the rage of seeing someone you love dehumanized. About the haunting helplessness of watching it happen and choosing not to explode because you know the world doesn't give you the luxury of losing control. People think strength is about force, he said, but the hardest thing I ever did was hold myself still while the world told me my wife was a threat. The episode went viral. Not because it was shocking, but because it was real. It wasn't just about race or policing or power. It was about people. About pain. About perseverance. Strangers sent messages. Survivors shared their own stories. A ripple began, not one that Isaiah or Danielle controlled, but one they had ignited. And it moved faster than they expected. One evening, Amari walked into the garage with a piece of paper in her hand. She had drawn a picture again. This time, it showed her family standing tall, her dad in the center, her mom with a laptop, and herself holding a small torch. At the bottom, in her messy handwriting, she had written, "We help people see." Danielle's eyes welled up. Isaiah picked up Amari, kissed her forehead, and held the drawing for a long time. Later that night, Danielle asked him what he thought came next. Isaiah answered honestly. "We keep going. Until there's nothing left for them to hide behind." She nodded. But there was something else in her expression, a worry she hadn't voiced yet. So she asked, "And what happens to us? To you? If this gets bigger than we can hold?" Isaiah looked at her, not with defiance, but with vulnerability. "Then we pass it. To someone else. But we don't stop until the last lie falls." As their work grew, so did the threats. Anonymous emails. Voicemails from blocked numbers. Even a car that followed Danielle one afternoon as she picked Amari up from school. They reported it all, documented everything. But it was a reminder, truth wasn't safe. Truth was war. And every piece of it they uncovered painted a target on their backs. Still, they didn't stop. And one night, as they reviewed a set of files anonymously submitted through a secure server, Danielle paused. The file was marked, Confessions, Internal. Inside were voice memos from former officers. Not just about the crimes they witnessed, but about why they stayed silent. One, in particular, struck them both. A man's voice, trembling. "I knew what Riker was doing. We all did. But when I spoke up, my supervisor told me if I kept pushing, I'd end up like Johnson. And Johnson didn't transfer. He just vanished. No paperwork. No follow-up. Just gone. I started telling myself it wasn't my responsibility. That I had a family to feed. That I couldn't afford to be a hero. But I see now, silence was a choice. And I chose wrong." Danielle covered her mouth. Isaiah clenched his fists. These weren't just leaks. They were cracks in the dam. And the dam was about to break. They looked at each other, hearts pounding with the weight of the moment. Because something was coming. And no one, on either side, was ready for the flood that would follow. It began as a wound, raw, exposed, unjust, but what it became was something no one expected. The final leak, titled The Flood, was released through multiple encrypted platforms simultaneously. It wasn't just a file drop. It was a full exposé, layered with verified testimony, audio confessions, classified surveillance documents, and a detailed map of how local enforcement, private contractors, and federal lobbyists had been working in tandem for years to maintain control over vulnerable communities. The publication didn't carry Isaiah's name. It wasn't branded or claimed. It stood on its own. But anyone who had followed the thread knew exactly where it had started. And more importantly, why. In the days that followed, Charlotte wasn't just shocked, it was transformed. Several high-ranking officials resigned in disgrace. A state senator publicly stepped down after his involvement in campaign laundering was uncovered. The police union's legal team collapsed under mounting pressure, and a federal task force began its slow but steady dismantling of the structures Isaiah and Danielle had traced with their bare hands. People marched, not in protest, but in power. Danielle was invited to speak before a bipartisan congressional ethics committee, not just as a victim, but as a researcher and reform strategist. She wore a simple dress that day, her wedding ring the only ornament on her fingers. And when she spoke, she didn't use notes. Her voice was steady. Her eyes unwavering. She didn't call for revenge. She called for reform. She told them the system was never broken, it was designed this way. And that it could be redesigned. Amari, watching from the back of the room beside Isaiah, held her father's hand tightly. She had watched her parents go from being invisible to unstoppable. When her mother finished, the applause was quiet, respectful. Not performative. It felt real. And for the first time, Isaiah saw what victory looked like without uniforms or medals. It looked like truth spoken plainly. It looked like a little girl seeing her mother honored for her voice, not her silence. As for Marcus Caldwell, the full extent of his operation was finally exposed. He had been more than an accessory, he had been an architect, manipulating contracts, intimidating whistleblowers, and designing surveillance strategies that targeted specific racial and activist profiles. The federal case against him grew too large to negotiate. He pled guilty. Not out of remorse, but out of calculation. In exchange, he provided critical information that helped dismantle several satellite programs in other cities. He would serve time, but not in isolation. His name would live on in classified briefings, but never again in the world of influence he once ruled. Riker, stripped of his badge, was found guilty on multiple charges including abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. He stared forward through the entire sentencing, stone-faced. No apologies. No recognition. But outside the courthouse, a mural had been painted on a brick wall nearby, a portrait of Danielle, eyes lifted, framed by a quote that read, "We fight not with fury, but with truth." Below it, someone had written, "For those who tried to silence her, now she speaks for all of us." And Isaiah didn't go back to hiding. He didn't disappear into a quiet job or relocate to another city to escape what had been done. He stayed. He became an advisor for a national initiative on ethical security practices, helping implement new protocols for accountability and transparency in local law enforcement. But more than that, he and Danielle opened a center for public data education, teaching everyday citizens how to understand systems, track patterns, and use truth as a tool of resistance. They didn't call themselves activists. They called themselves teachers. One evening, months after the dust had settled and a cautious peace returned to the streets, Isaiah stood outside that same grocery store parking lot. The asphalt hadn't changed. The layout was the same. But there were new signs up now. New policies. And most importantly, new people watching. A security guard nodded at him, a young black man in uniform, posture straight. Isaiah nodded back. There was no need for words. Danielle joined him a few minutes later, her hand slipping into his. They stood there for a while in silence, watching cars come and go. Life moved forward. It always did. But something had shifted, permanently. Not in the city. Not just in the systems. But in them. They had been burned and rebuilt, not as who they were, but as who they had always had the power to be. And when Amari joined them, running up with a crumpled paper in her hand, another drawing, another vision of the world through her eyes, Isaiah looked down and smiled. It wasn't over. It might never be over. But they weren't waiting anymore. They were building. together. Now, let me ask you something. How many times have we seen stories like this begin, but never end the way they should? How many people are silenced, not by violence, but by exhaustion, by a system that feeds on delay and distraction until the truth fades away? This wasn't just a story about injustice. It was about the decision to fight it even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. It was about love turned into action. Silence turned into strategy. Pain turned into purpose. So tell me, if you were in Isaiah's shoes, would you have had the strength to stand still that day? Would you have had the discipline to not let rage lead? And more than that, would you have had the courage to keep going when justice stopped being loud and became lonely? Comment below and let us know what this story meant to you. What would you have done? And what do you think this says about the world we're living in right now? And if this story moved you, if it made you reflect, if it opened your eyes to something you hadn't seen before, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that makes you feel something real. We'll be right here, telling the stories that matter. One truth at a time.